Tom,
Yes.
thank you very much for your time. We are in Vienna at the International Conference of Analytical Psychology. Yesterday you had a very interesting workshop. But before to get to the workshop, I would like to ask you my usual question. Who is Carl Gustav Jung? Or even better, who is your own Carl Gustav Jung?
Well, that would assume that I have one Jung. And I think probably if one has followed Jung or in the Jungian tradition, there are different Jungs at different stages of life. And so, in a way, the Jung that I most resonate with now, which would be quite different than when I was a younger medical student 30, 40 years ago or more, 50 years ago, the Jung that I first came across or that was first important to me is very different than the Jung that's important to me now. I don't read a lot of Jung now, and I consider myself a Jungian. Somebody said, or I read somewhere, that I was a post-Jungian, and I didn't think of myself as being a post-Jungian. I like what the post-Jungians do, but I think of myself as being very directly in the line of Jung. And the Jung that's most important to me now is the Jung that had a great sensitivity to the collective psyche. Not the collective unconscious even, but the collective psyche. And maybe the first Jung that was important to me that links the two was the Jung that actually thought there was such a thing as psyche and believed in psyche. And in 1967, when I began my Jungian analysis, when I was in great distress, the Jung that was important to me was the Jung who believed that there was an inner world and that it was important, which in the 60s was not, that was a very unconventional point of view. The reality of the inner world was not a assumption that many people made or talked about or thought about. And in that sense, my Jung today is I'm very consistent with that, because it's the Jung who believed in the reality of the psyche that is most important to me. At one time, it was the reality of the psyche, the individual psyche or the personal psyche, because that's where I was most distressed. Now it's much more the Jung who tapped into something called the collective psyche, because I'm really, in some ways, much less interested in myself than I am in the collective psyche and the distress of the collective psyche. And of course, the Jung who knew about that was the Jung who started having visions prior to World War I, when he imagined, he saw in a vision more than once, I think 3 times, the map of Europe being covered in blood, and he thought he was having a personal psychosis because it was after the breakup with Freud, and he thought he was very disoriented, and that these dreams were about some sort of personal psychotic process. But then the war broke out, and he realized that he was tuned into something in the collective psyche that was deeply disturbing, and he had the same thing prior to World War II as well. And he had such a lively connection to what we can think of as the collective psyche. And I find that that's what's most interesting to me now. So it would be the Jung who was interested in the collective psyche, through which what he called archetypes sometimes made their appearance. So that's a brief answer to which Jung I happen to follow. I don't read a lot of Jung now, but every once in a while I'll think of a quote and I can't remember where it is or even what it is, but I call up John Beebe, who remembers all of that stuff, and he can usually point me to the quote that I'm looking for.
That's a very interesting way to connect with Jung again. You mentioned Jung's dreams that linked to World War I, World War II. What are dreams? Why are we so fond of dreams in our work with patients?
Well, actually, the what he had prior to World War I don't think were dreams. They were really visions. They were waking visions.
Yeah, right.
And so, and I think there's a difference between a dream and a vision, where in a dream you're asleep and presumably what we call the unconscious is activated, and it expresses itself in sometimes very dramatic visual imagery with quite a storyline and a narrative. And I think when I began my analysis, dreams were considered, they were, as Freud described it, the royal road to the unconscious. And I think for the Jungians, a dream is also the royal road to the unconscious, because it opened a door to underlying issues, conflicts, drives, fears, hopes. And for me, what's always been compelling about dreams, or the so-called big dreams, where there's a full narrative, there's a story that gets told. And in that story, there are actors who appear, as well as the ego of the dreamer, my own ego. And the actors I think of there being a dream narrator or a dream director, or I always like the casting director of dreams. Whoever chooses the figure that appears in dreams is the most amazing phenomenon in the world, because what I've found over time is that who appears in a dream, one only needs to think for a few moments about that person, and then what comes to mind is a whole cluster of feelings and thoughts, and always the person is perfectly cast for the role. I love the casting director of dreams. So dreams are really messages from the unconscious about things that may be going on beneath consciousness that are very important. Sometimes they're not important. And for instance, I probably am paying less attention to dreams now than I did for maybe 30 or 40 years, when I have stacks of dream books, and I felt that the dream was everything, and that you really needed a dream to know what you thought and what you felt and what was going on. I don't have the same relationship to dreams now that I did then.
Is it because the more you grow older, you become wiser, and you less need help from the dreams for direction? Because it's not the first time that I hear this from an experienced Jungian.
Is that right?
I don't look at my dream anymore.
Yeah.
I don't care. So my question is it because you grow, you know more or less who you are? Better than in my age, for sure.
Well, I don't know if you know more about yourself, or you just don't care as much about yourself, or you've become more or less who you are, and you know more or less who you are, and you know more or less the themes that concern you. And so it doesn't have the same mystery and numinosum. And also, hopefully, I'm 77, by my stage in life, I've gotten enough in life that it's not that the dreams are less important, but you've lived more of your life, and that's what is. When you're a young person, a man or a woman, you don't know much about yourself, and you don't know much about the world, and you're in search of both, often because you're troubled and distressed, and so you turn to dreams if you happen to be more introverted. But I wouldn't claim to know
who you are. Well, let me ask you another question. Actually, I wanted to ask you, what is Carl Gustav Jung relevance today? Sociology claims that the world is out of joint. And many people could say, yes, the world is out of joint. I don't believe so. What is your point of view? Is the world out of joint?
Well, I guess it's really interesting because the theme of age is coming up so quickly, and perspective, and I guess the question is it out of joint in relationship to what? It almost assumes that there was a time when it was in joint.
Exactly.
And I mean, when Jung was in the 20th century, I think the world was out of joint. I mean, the existentialist, whom I really was more interested in as a younger man, I came to Jung a little bit later on, so I really was interested in the existentialist.
Who?
The existentialist.
Yeah, especially
Camus was sort of primary for me because of when I was in high school. I started to read The Stranger and The Plague and The Fall, and actually when I was
that's why you're a friend of Andrew Summers. He also was very close to Camus.
Was he? I didn't know that. I didn't know that. Yeah, well, that's sort of prior to that's sort of between the two world wars and after the world wars, and what they had discovered was that the world was absurd. There was no God, and that Sartre's famous statement that existence preceded essence. There was no pre-existing essence, and therefore you had to create yourself out of
nothing,
or out of absurdity, without any hope for any
reconciliation or
So you could say the whole existentialist movement was in response to a world that was out of joint. I mean, 2 world wars, the Great Depression. So is the world more out of joint now than it was in the 20th century? I think it's just out of joint in a different way. I do think the world's out of joint. I mean, it's terrifying. And it's overwhelming, and I think people around the world are overwhelmed, overstimulated and overwhelmed. And so if out of joint means that you're not centered in who you are, or your town is not centered in who it is, or your city is not centered, or your nation, or whatever you identify with, it all does feel out of joint, particularly living in the United States today, where we're so distressed with our current president and everything that he symbolizes, because Trump wouldn't be anything without the people who support him. And the people who support him probably are feeling so distressed that they're being magnetized by a demagogue, a dangerous demagogue. So yes, the world is out of joint. Is it any more or less out of joint than when Hitler rose to power in Germany, or when World War I began, the war to end all wars? 1914.
But that's interesting because both events, the beginning of World War I, which started after the killing of Franz Ferdinand, the heir to the crown of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Austria started war against Serbia, and then other states like Russia stepped in, UK stepped in, the French stepped in. It all started from here, Vienna. World War II, and this is my post yesterday in this post Where We Are, is about Hitler coming to Vienna in 1938, announcing the Anschluss, so the annexion of Austria to Germany, again in Vienna. It seems a city where Europe started, Europe ended, or a certain time stopped. And in the last century, so
Mhm.
many things happened. World War One, World War Two,
Mhm.
time of, let's say, peace, but then again, troubled times. Now let me ask you a question about your own work. What are cultural complexes? How you came up to this idea? You were not alone, but it's very interesting for me what you did. And of course, for me, you're post-Jungian. If you brought up such a concept, that enhance, develop Jung thoughts beyond Jung in a time that after Jung's death, I would say.
Well, I think the notion of a cultural complex is implicit in Jung. And I think Joseph Henderson, whom I analyzed with and studied with and followed, came up with the idea of a cultural level of the unconscious. And he went in a different direction. He populated the cultural unconscious with a kind of typological model. He saw that there were different types of, and I can't even remember them, but he sort of created like Jung's typology of introvert and extrovert and so on. Henderson thought of the cultural unconscious as being constituted of different cultural attitudes that people had, one of which was a social attitude, and for Henderson, the ultimate was a psychological attitude. I think, first of all, I think the idea of the cultural complex is actually implicit in Jung, and I think there are even places where one feels like that's what he's talking about, although he doesn't quite say it so explicitly. But remind me of the question again. I'm getting a little
Let's
lost.
start with cultural complex.
Uh-huh.
How did you come to the cultural complex? You answered, but what is it about?
Well, when you're with people as an analyst, you hear a lot about their personal problems and what we, as Jungians, think of as personal complexes. But we also hear in our patients, and when we read the newspaper, we hear of a whole other layer of human experience and psyche, the reality of the psyche expressing itself at the cultural level of the psyche, which means that it's not personal. The contents aren't personal. The contents are, they're about groups and nations, and what people are concerned with are much less about themselves. It's not that they're not concerned about themselves, but at the cultural level of the psyche, their problems also, in my mind, take the form of complexes, but they're cultural complexes. So, for instance, if I give you an example, it's in the United States, we've been having a battle about health care for the last 50 to 100 years. When Clinton became president, he rode a wave of sentiment against large insurance companies, which were the primary form of people receiving their benefits for health care. And that failed, and as a result, we had some 40 to 50 million Americans uninsured, which meant that they had no access to health care other than going to emergency rooms, which were terribly inefficient and very costly, and there was no continuity of care. So there's a tremendous problem with health care. And Obama came along and he started something called the Affordable Care Act, which was also known as Obamacare, which was meant to fill the gap of these 40 to 50 million uninsured people. Well, the Republicans were very smart. They hated the idea because they felt everybody should be self-sufficient. And they hated the idea of the big government coming in and paying for these things. So they changed the name from the Affordable Care Act to Obamacare. They personalized it And then they added to that layers of anti-black racist feelings, accusations that it was a communist kind of conspiracy or socialist conspiracy, the feeling that that individuals were supposed to be responsible for themselves. There's a whole layering of ideas, ideology really, that got triggered by the word Obamacare, which is the word that the Republicans gave to this Affordable Care Act. Well, if you look at that, that's a cultural complex in the same way that Jung, in his earliest word association tests, talked about a complex where if you did time responses to certain words, the response was delayed, and therefore he postulated that there was some interference, unconscious process interfering, and that's what he called a complex. Well, you can say the same thing is true not at the personal level of the psyche, but at the cultural or social level of the psyche. And if you can get a trigger word like Obamacare, and it activates a whole host of
emotion,
of ideas, very simple ideas. Actually, I have 4 or 5 characteristics when you ask what is a cultural complex. And people rarely use these characteristics that I've tried to describe, but I think they're important because it's about affect, deep emotion. It's about memory. A complex usually involves highly specific memories that accrue additional memories to themselves. They're self-affirming memories, emotions, ideas that are simplistic and repetitive. They're autonomous like a complex. That is, they repeat themselves and they have a life of their own that's beneath the level of consciousness. Mm-hmm. So there's memory, there's affect, there's cognition, and behavior. Mm-hmm. When you stimulate a complex, you can think of it almost as a neurobiological phenomenon. I actually anticipate there will be a day when the neurophysiologist will be able to locate the linking of memory, ideation, image. I left out image. They're potent images, ideation, affect, memory, behavior. These are all different parts of the brain. And my hypothesis is that in time, if you give the right stimulus word, like Obamacare, you'll see all these different parts of the brain lighting up and activating a very powerful sort of response in the same way that a personal complex activates a response. Well, then, of course, the question is, well, why do you care about that? Well, I care about it because I see our global society in the grips of cultural complexes that are firing off, almost like the fires in the Amazon now. Everywhere you turn, if you use the wrong trigger word, or say the wrong thing, you get these powerful levels of emotion. People are highly reactive around all sorts of issues, whether it be gender, race, socioeconomic issues, class issues. And the problem is that when they're stimulated, there can be no conversation because they have their own point of view that is self-affirming, and there's no room for any other discussion, because of the simplicity of the ideas. I don't know if that's clear enough.
It's a perfect example, and actually makes me puzzle and worry even more about what is our joint, because when Jung was working on his association experiment, he had trigger words. But when you think that the Republicans work on a propaganda machine and change the name of this act and put the personalization of a man who is the president, who's a black president, the first black president, who came into the world stage with many expectation, maybe even more outside the US than in the US. This is propaganda, and it's very, very dangerous. And the result we can see the result today. So it's even bigger than what perhaps Jung was doing. How can your theory, the approach of cultural complex, actually fight back? I asked you this question, which sounds maybe a bit weird, but if I think of your workshop yesterday, titled "Making the Bridge the application of Jungian theory in the treatment of collective conflict. We live in a time of conflict. Everywhere in the world there are conflicts. It's not new. There will always be conflict. It would be naive to think that we live in peace and like following Fukuyama that, you know, the world will be a beautiful liberal democracy. Yeah, of course, and we see the consequences now, right, of this naive thinking. But what do you mean? What did you mean yesterday when you and Jerome Bernstein had this workshop titled Making the Bridge?
Well, that's a really good and difficult question, because I started off my remarks in the workshop by saying we Jungians and the Freudians and psychoanalysts and psychotherapists have had at least 100 years to make the world better. And as Andrew Samuels would like to say, we've sort of failed the test. So I actually would not make any special claims for the efficacy, for the concept of cultural complexes offering a cure to the world's problems. And I think Jerome Bernstein, whom I admire very much, I think he's had, I think he believes more strongly than I do that Jung's ideas can be applied to the world in a way that will help resolve conflicts. I have my doubts about that. But I think we have something to offer, at least as I think about it, I think we have something to offer, not in terms of a practical remedy for specific problems, but I think there's an educational function that we can provide. I think we have, part of our argument yesterday was that Jung provided certain ideas and tools that over time might be helpful to people in terms of understanding why we have such difficulties. And to me, it may be mostly about education. That if we can offer a point of view that doesn't just make sense to people in rational terms, but speaks to the emotional reality of being a citizen, whether it be in Poland or France or England or the United States or Iraq or Iran or wherever, that I think we have tools that can offer people ways of understanding themselves and the groups in which they live that might be helpful. Now,
an additional tool. I really like it.
Additional tool, yeah.
Additional tool.
An additional tool. Now, I'll give you an example of an applied application, which is I wrote an op-ed piece in the last week or so. An op-ed piece is something you write and submit to a newspaper. And so far I've submitted it to the New York Times and I didn't hear anything back. And I've submitted it to the Washington Post and I haven't heard anything back. And I wrote this letter with a couple of friends, but basically I don't say cultural complexes, but I'm relying on the idea to inform an opinion about what the Democrats need to do to defeat the Republicans in 2020. So I'm actually, in a way, using my theory to inform me on about the advice I would give to the Democratic Party if they would listen to me. And at the heart of it is Michelle Obama, whom I admire, as many of us do greatly, said when the Republicans or when Trump takes the low road, we take the high road. Well, actually, I think that's bad advice. I think that the Democrats and Obama himself shied away from conflict. He kept trying to build bridges with the Republicans, and they had no interest in building bridges, and they had no interest in compromise. And it cost Obama maybe the first 6 years of his presidency because he was unwilling to take them on. And so I argue that the Democrats can't take the high road exclusively. The high road would be about good policy. The low road is about appealing to human emotion, negative emotion, hatred, violence. Now, I'm not advocating hatred or violence, but what I do say is that the Democrats better tap into a deeper layer of their collective psychic reality, which has to do with hatred and fear, all these emotions that we don't like to have. But if we're going to beat Trump, we need to mobilize those emotions, not to go out and buy guns and kill people, but to mobilize everything we have to defeat Trump. That's actually relying, believe it or not, on the cultural complex theory. We need to respond to their hatred with our own deep emotion.
I really like what you just said, but it made me think of something else. To say when they go low, we go high is a bit bourgeois. I try to express myself, especially because Michelle Obama was not born in a bourgeois family. Not even Hillary Clinton, not even Bill Clinton, but they became. The Democrats, as well as the left-wing parties, Italian in Italy, in France, in England, the Labour Party, with Tony Blair, they all moved to shake hands with the bankers, with the bourgeoisie, with the industry, and they lost contact with the people, the working class. Is there any working class right now? But the Republicans, or as you see in Italy, in France, in Germany with AfD, in England, they're very good to talking to people, but they talk to people the way you express, with propaganda, with trigger words, which the left, maybe because it's too intellectual, too well educated, is a bit on the clouds, not grounded.
Absolutely. In fact, the trigger word, the cultural complex trigger word that Trump began his march to the presidency was with politically correct. He said politically correct 1,000 times, which was basically all the things that you should think and feel as a compassionate citizen of the world, which had to do with diversity and multiplicity, all the things that we actually believe about race and gender and diversity. They're all good things, but they became a kind of righteous political correctness. And Trump intuited, this is a cultural complex at work, that there was a huge layer of resentment about political correctness. People had all sorts of angry, ugly feelings about having to be a certain way, which denied their own feelings of being excluded and their own feelings of going downward in a socioeconomic sense. So he tapped into the dirty little secret that a lot of people didn't want to be politically correct. They wanted to be politically incorrect. And that was
to finally be politically incorrect and being not guilty about it.
Yes, that's right.
Because we went through 30, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, 30 years of politically correctness.
That's true in Europe then too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Where you have to watch out what you say, how you say it. And then it's like this morning, at the end of the second conference, this man said, is there a space for violence?
Yeah.
Where is violence?
Yeah, it was a very good question. I liked Rob Tominski's response as well, because he said we're so flooded with violence, which is also true.
But we put it under the cover.
Well, we put, it's a, so that would be about a cultural complex, which what do you do with all of these angry, hateful feelings, whether it's on the left or in the right, in the middle. And so in that sense, maybe using the cultural complex theory is to be wise about your opponents and know where they're getting the energy, the psychic energy, to mobilize people into a frenzy, and the need to counter that with your own deep emotion. That would take some knowledge, whether you call it a cultural complex or not.
Let me ask you another question about Trump, which is a question I ask myself, because Trump made a very good job to be elected the way he was elected. Nobody was expecting him. At the beginning, it was the buffoon, the clown. The way Hillary Clinton treated him, top-down look in the public speech, was amazing. Do you think he had a big strategic propagandistic machine behind it, or it was much more intuition, being able to connect with a certain population that made the biggest part of the job? Because this is a cultural context too. How one man can connect. And Obama did the same. He could connect with such a big audience in 2006 after the big speech he had at the Congress, at the Democratic Congress.
Well, actually, I think that it's not an either or in terms of was it Trump's unique intuitive genius about political incorrectness and his willingness to trample over any of the normative values of how one behaves in public or in the political arena. He was willing to trample all over that. So it was his behavior, and it was his speech, and it was his intuition. On the other hand, there's a newly released film, I don't know if you've had a chance to see it yet, by Netflix called The Great Hack.
No, not yet.
You need to see The Great Hack because he had this is the Cambridge Analytica story. And Trump used his own political genius, if you will. People may resent the fact that I call it genius, but he had an intuition about the shadowy side of the emotional life of many Americans. But he also had Cambridge Analytica, which was collecting 5,000 data points on millions of Americans, and then identifying very specific areas in the country where the election would be decided. And then using those data points about individuals to tailor advertisements, political advertisements, specifically to groups of people in very specific regions, playing on what they identified from these data points, which were stolen or given to them by Facebook. It's somewhat obscure as to it. But they had all these data points, so they pinpointed political advertising to the crucial voters that they called the persuadables. And that's where they won the election. So that it was actually a combination of Trump's political genius, if you will, plus very sophisticated modern tools based on hacking of information about people that targeted specific propaganda messages to them. And that's apparently what really did both of those things combined.
This propaganda machine is scary, but we're organizing a conference in 2020 in San Francisco, just before the election.
Yes.
I wish to present an abstract. The title I have in mind is The Fascist Among Us. Because it's very easy to see the fascists.
Yes.
You,
yes.
in him,
yes.
in her. But
Yeah.
what about us?
Yeah.
Especially us as psychoanalysts.
Yeah.
When do we become a fascist
Yeah.
with our peer groups or with our patients?
Yeah.
So this is my idea about what is this conference about?
Well, first of all, I hope you will present a proposal. Are you actually planning to do that?
Yeah.
Good. Well, it's due pretty soon, so I hope you do it soon, and that sounds really interesting. And this conference is a combination of two conferences that have had a life of their own. One is the Analysis and Activism Conference that a group of people, Stefano Carpani and Elijah Keel, I always have trouble with their first Elijah's name, and Andrew Samuels, I think have been the prime movers, and Lynn Franco and I from San Francisco have joined with them. So there's the Analysis and Activism Conference, which has had three conferences so far, one in London, one in Prague, and one in Rome. And that's that group of Jungians to which I belong, which is actively exploring the interface between being an analyst or being an analysis and activism. It's joined forces with what we've had since 2000. This will be our 6th presidency conference in San Francisco. And every 4 years we have a conference the Jung Institute in San Francisco puts on to discuss the presidential elections in terms of our psychological understanding. So it's the interface between psyche and politics. So these two conferences, the two separate conferences are coming together, and I imagine 2020 in October is going to be
Tense. Tense. Yeah.
Very tense. So it's a time when we're hoping that we can talk about the interface of a psychological perspective and sociological perspective, perhaps economic perspective, and what's happening politically. Psyche is at the center of it, I think.
I totally agree, especially because this is a time where fascism is not a party, it's a way of living your life, perhaps unconscious. You know, that you become a fascist, although you don't know. You know, the fascist attitude, and this is widespread in so many countries, especially Western countries now. Again,
it must come. I really hope you submit this proposal, and since I'm on the committee, I'll do whatever I can to make sure it's accepted. But it's a very important idea, and it's happening all over the world. And I guess the question is, what is this fascist attitude in response to? What's fueling? Because a fascist attitude is only one potential attitude
Right.
that we could take.
right.
And I imagine it's fear-based, and I imagine it's that the world has gotten too complex and overwhelming for people, and that's when you rigidify, and of course fascism is about a rigidified attitude to oneself and to other people. And it does seem to be, but of course those of us more on the left, I'm not as on the left as many, but those on the left can also be as fascistic as.
This is my point.
That's your point, yeah.
This is my point.
Yeah.
The fascist in us is
Yes.
not the one the right way
Yes.
or the open fascist. But
Yeah.
what about the left wing or the mild center, center left, center right, who suddenly, because of the collective unconscious or because of the cultural conflict, become a fascist, act like a fascist?
Well, you see, I think that's what Trump actually tuned into with political correctness. I think what he was signaling to his base, or the base that he was creating, was we have all these fascists on the left who are telling us how to behave.
Yeah, yeah. And fascists on the right,
Yes.
who stop because they know they're wrong. I will end this beautiful conversation quoting an author I really like, an Austrian author who was loved and hated here in Vienna, Thomas Bernhard. He said, he wrote this in 1988, he said, there are more Nazis now in Vienna than in 1938. Unfortunately, he was right. Now if we swap the word Nazi with fascist, there are much more fascists now than during the World War II, because also the countries that were, let's say, on the good side are moving to the right wing.
Yeah.
But I hope things will change.
I hope so too. It does feel like we're living in a very oppressive every day for us in the United States, for those who really hate Trump with a political incorrectness. We hate Trump. It's like living under a very dark, frightening cloud. And living under Obama, even though he had his weaknesses and flaws, it was truly a hopeful time. And
Absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much. That was fun.
Thank you.
Yeah.